in the course so far, right? We began with class number 1, which is, let's just show that there is some purpose in even having this conversation, right? That faith is rational, and that it even makes sense for us to pursue it, right? And then we said, okay, then, well, let's use our rationality to pursue it. And so in the classes 2 and 3, we looked at the arguments for the existence of God, using math and science and philosophy. And then last week we said, okay, if we conclude there's a God, then because of all the things we had in class 2 and 3, what does this imply? Well, it implies at least one thing, which is we need some information from this being then about reality. There are things we won't be able to understand on our own. And this is why we have the Bible. It's sort of the message from the creator being saying, look, there are some things in your reality you can't figure out. Let me tell you how it is. About morality and purpose, your relationship with one another, your relationship with me, reality beyond this physical, sort of eternity, right? These things we won't be able to discover by science and math. So God says, here's the answer. So then the question though becomes, okay, so the Bible purports to, answer these questions for us. Well, is the Bible reliable? Okay, if the Bible's telling us it has the answers, can we trust it? And the first sort of thing you might be thinking that means is someone saying, is the Bible true? But in fact, we actually have to deal with a more core issue with people saying, don't even bother asking if the Bible is true or not, because the Bible's so corrupted, you don't even know what it says, right? So this is the core objection that Muslims and Mormons have about the Bible. So ostensibly, Muslims and Mormons both believe the Bible's true. Is that a question?
Corrupted in what sense?
Yeah, so essentially that when it was originally written, thousands of years ago, the things it said were accurate. But the problem is that over 2,000 years, people changed it because to fit their political whims, or, there were just copying errors, or, there are things like, for example, people say like, Jesus never claimed to be God. This was added in later to give the church authority and power over people by saying like, look, Jesus is God, Jesus says do this, therefore you should listen. Right? So this is their contention that all these claims about Jesus, about what he said, they're just not accurate to what he actually said. Okay, and that's why in Mormonism they have obviously the Book of Mormon and other things. They're sort of like setting the record straight, so to speak. In Islam, obviously they had Muhammad come as sort of like they all believe Jesus is a prophet, a very important prophet, but just that we can't trust what the Bible says about him. So Muhammad's like, I'm going to set the record straight and tell you how things really are, right? But they basically believe that if the Bible say we're accurate, we should all believe it. It's just that it's not, and so we can't. So again, this is a much more fundamental idea than is the Bible true? It's that you can't even ask the question if it's true, because you don't even know what it's meant to be saying. Okay, so this is going to be the first thing we're going to be analyzing today is, can we even read the Bible and just grapple with what it says? Or are we so hopelessly, millennia too late to even understand it? Okay, so that's where we're going to be beginning today.
Too, there's that whole thing about the translations, right? Where, oh, well, how could it possibly be accurate because everybody's translated it so differently?
Right, yes, exactly. That's another part of it too. So what we're going to do, I don't think I have slides that quite line up, but that's okay. We're going to look at sort of the historical criteria for ancient documents. Okay, so, again, in the earlier classes, we were looking at things through sort of mathematical and scientific lens and philosophical lens. Now we're sort of entering the lens of looking at it like a historian does, okay? And part of why we have to do this is, of course, because the Bible is, of course, old. And the way that historians look at old documents is not the same as how they look at, contemporary ones, obviously, because the technology that we take for granted didn't exist then. And so there's a lot of problems with ancient documents that aren't the same today. Right now, no one has a meal without documenting it for the world to see on Instagram, whatever, right? So we have way more information than we could ever possibly want or need, but that wasn't the case back then. And so there's a bunch of criteria that historians use. So again, this is not biblical scholars right? These are not Christian scholars. This is just historians. Okay, this is the criteria they use to analyze any ancient document. Okay, and one of them is the accuracy amongst the manuscripts or copies. Now, as is the case with most, or perhaps even all, ancient documents, we do not possess the original like pieces of paper that the Bible was actually written on. Okay, all we actually have are copies. Okay, and this is basically how most ancient documents are, right? Like for whatever we have, we usually don't have like the original thing it was penned on. We have some usually like orally transmitted, copy, and that's the best we got. Okay. Now, in a sense, people may think, well, therefore you shouldn't trust the Bible at all, right? But what we're going to see is that if that were true, we shouldn't trust anything about any ancient document, basically prior to the printing press. Okay, but that's not how society functions, right? So it's not really a valid principle. So what we're going to do, actually, we're going to compare how the Bible measures up to what we know about Alexander the Great. Okay, presumably we know Alexander the Great, Empire of Greece, conquered, basically the whole known world at the time, fantastically successful military emperor. And we probably all basically believe that the things we know about him are true. I don't think there's a lot of contention about the life of Alexander the Great. So, but let's see here. So let's all use A as like Alexander the Great and B for Bible. So of all the sources we have on Alexander the Great, right, we have a bunch of different, sort of copies and records. And when they refer to the same event, they tend to agree amongst themselves about 66% of the time. Okay, so 1 out of every 3 times, one of the copies or manuscripts we have will say something different. Now, some of this may just be due to cultural context, right? So, of course, for anyone who's been in the church long enough will know that this church was somewhat recently named Maple Ridge Baptist Church, and now it is called Ridge Church. So if someone were to say, if, in a written thing or whatever, I went to Maple Ridge Baptist Church, and someone said I went to Ridge Church, removed from the context, this would actually seem like a contradiction. But in fact, such a person may just lack the cultural context, understanding that, no, that's the same place.
I'm sorry, how so? Is it a contradiction?
Well, because someone will say, like, let's just say I wrote down, in my personal blog, whatever, I taught the apologetics class at Maple Ridge Baptist Church on today's date. And then in some other context, I wrote, I taught it at Ridge Church. Someone would say, contradiction, right. You can't trust this guy, he's a liar, or whatever, right? But of course, it's true. It's just that, again, there is a context that might be missing. So this number may actually be higher. We just don't really, we lack the context to verify some things that could actually be saying the same thing, but to our, mind, millennia later, we just lack the understanding that, like, when they say some place name, all the locals knew, like, oh, they just had a second name, kind of thing, right? Mm-hmm. So it seems a little bit low, but again, it might be higher. But actually, this is actually very high compared to most ancient documents. Usually, they're quite rife with sort of errors and contradictions. So the fact that it's even 66% is actually really good. The Bible is like, it's almost 100. It's so like unreasonably accurate that it defies all reason. So, some places someone may have missed like a the or an and or something like this, okay? But the accuracy defies sense, right? They had people copying the Bible basically all over, Europe, essentially, mostly. There's Coptic versions in Egypt and things like that, right? By hand, okay? And yet somehow they're all extraordinarily accurate, even over centuries.
Sorry, I'm curious, like, don't get me wrong,
Mm-hmm.
Just for the sake of challenge only. Yeah. So where are you basing the 99.999% on? Like, where is that coming from?
Yeah, so this is basically coming, I can send out like a document later with all the sort of sources.
Oh, it's got the sources. Okay.
Yeah. So
fair.
I'm not a textual critic.
No.
So these are, this is information that I've sort of assembled here. But this would basically be, textual scholars looking at all the copies we have, basically seeing the volume of the text divided by number of errors across the copies, right?
Sorry, I just was curious.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah.
I believe you. I just wanted to take a challenge.
Yeah.
Though.
No, yeah.
I kind of wondered.
Yeah, for sure. Absolutely. So again, I think the question would have to be, why on earth is this number so high? Because it's very much unlike all other ancient documents. So that's a little bit strange. Where are we here? Oh, and one really interesting example, of course, is the Dead Sea Scrolls. Because when the Dead Sea Scrolls were found, or sorry, before they were found, I should say, again, there was a much more frequent objection to the Bible, saying again that it had just been corrupted over time. Okay, so when the Dead Sea Scrolls were found, originally this was sort of like to the skeptic, perfect, the Bible's done for, because we found these documents that are, again, millennia old, right? The Old Testament before Christ. It's going to annihilate everything it says in the Bible. And what they found is, no, it's the same. Everything is the same in the Dead Sea Scrolls as the Bible today. And so we show that over, again, millennia, the Bible wasn't changed, right? It was actually preserved essentially perfectly. So even taking, again, contemporary documents, comparing them to millennia old scrolls found in the cave, they're the same. Yeah, no problem, right? So again, just underscore this idea that there is no corruption, and even across millennia, which is like an absurd amount of time, you'd think all kinds of errors could creep in. That's actually basically the same, right? So Dead Sea Scrolls is a really, really good example of the accuracy being preserved over, millennia. So another one would be the volume of sources. Okay. Because of course, if you have only one source, well, it's going to be in 100% accuracy with itself. Okay, so this is not so useful, right? You want as many sources as possible so that you can start to see whether there is any divergence, maybe even any regional divergence. Like I mentioned, we have Coptic Bibles, right? So this is from like the Greek or the Egyptian church, right? Maybe they wrote something different, and the Orthodox Church in Turkey wrote something different, and the Anglican Church wrote something different, right? You can start to see like some splintering of the text, right? If you have a lot of sources. So for Alexander the Great, we have 3. Now again, for ancient documents, this is amazing. To have 3 is a treasure, because most ancient works have 0, right? They'll be referred to, but we have no copies. I mean, this is of course even true in the Bible, right? Paul references letters that we don't have, right? So Paul's letters, some of them have been lost. But in ancient sort of documents, this is most common. So in some, work, they'll say, paraphrase, well, according to, the writings of Plato in this document, he says this. We have no way to verify that because we don't have that document. Okay. So even having 3 is wildly amazing. Okay, that's pretty good. The Bible has about 25,000. And I'll show you how it breaks down here. This is sort of more specifically the New Testament, just because it started obviously spreading much further than sort of the more insular sort of Old Testament in Israel, right? Okay, we have 5,800 Greek manuscripts. And a lot of these are full copies of the Bible, the entire thing. Some are fragmented, but a lot of them are full.
Wow, that's a lot.
Yeah. 10,000 Latin and 9,300 other. So this would be, some combination of Syriac, Slavic, Gothic, Ethiopian, Coptic, and Armenian.
It's my understanding that, like, for example, the Coptic Bible, it does include some different books, correct?
Yeah, so some traditions will include what they call the Apocrypha,
right,
which are books that, the Protestant church have decided to exclude, and other, Coptic, Catholicism, others have decided to include them. I have not personally read the Apocrypha, so I don't really have any comments on that. But yeah, there is, some, they do include a few other books in there. And I suppose that is a good question, but not really necessarily related to this exact thing. But yeah, it's an interesting thing, why they include it and why they put it. So again, what we see here is, I mean, a staggering number. Just like, it boggles the mind. Why on earth, where, 3 for Alexander the Great is amazing. How, aside from divine providence, would there be 25,000 copies of the Bible? Again, across, sort of the whole sort of known world, so to speak, right? Greek, Latin, which is, Roman, all through, Africa and across Europe. This is bizarre, right? Again, apart from sort of this divine providence, this is really, really weird. And so now, one thing we can think about at this point would be, to anyone who claims, again, like so the Mormon or the Muslim, that over time the Bible had become corrupted, they would have to explain why we have so many copies from across time, across culture, all agreeing with each other. Because if it were the fact that it had been corrupted, we should find this splintering, right? Where, here's in 400 AD, someone first made the claim that Jesus was God. And we see how that spread throughout this region, but all the other regions don't include that. Or this kind of thing, right? We would see all these splinterings happen across time and culture and sort of physical region. We don't see anything like that. So for anyone to claim the Bible's been corrupted over time, they would have to explain why we have no historical sort of archaeological record of it, right? And I don't know how you would explain it. There's too many copies across too broad a period of time, across such a broad geographical area, that if it had been corrupted by local groups or whatever, you would see it splintering. Because we still have copies from very, very, very early. And I can't remember if I had mentioned this or not before, but I'll mention it sort of here. We can contrast this with something from the sort of Islamic world. Let me just get some of these things have difficult apostrophes. Okay, Sana manuscripts. Okay, so if you are a fan of Islamic history, one thing you may know is that sort of at the height of the Islamic Empire, it spread quite far. There was a bit of a problem because different regions sort of had their own versions of the Quran and versions of sort of interpreting it, how they wanted. And so what they decided to do was, this is all very well documented. It's not controversial. You can go look it up. They decided they're going to burn every scrap of the Quran. Any piece of paper that had any word from the Quran will be burned. And they would make 5 official versions, send 1 to each kind of corner of the Islamic Empire, and that's it. Okay, everyone gets the same version. Now, first of all, if you have seen any movie or TV show, if people are entering, the federal agents are raiding a building and their solution is let's burn all the evidence, usually it's a bad sign. Okay, but anyway, let's think about this though. So there is I can't remember why it's called Sana manuscript, but basically there's some attic in Ethiopia where someone has found fragments of a Quran pre-purge, and they're now studying it. And one reason you may not hear about it is because the people studying it are afraid for their lives because of the things they're finding in there. Yeah. Because they're not really lining up with what's in the official Quran. I mean, again, this is not hidden. It's not like some conspiracy. You can go research it, but they just don't like talking about it because obviously you can find examples of people talking about things sort of against the Quran and they are murdered, right? Or they get a fatwa put out on them, right? So they basically can be assassinated on sight. So again, this is not meant to be some silver bullet of well, don't believe the Quran then. But I think a little bit of what's good for the goose is good for the gander here, I think is fair, right? If the Islamic person is claiming the Bible is very corrupted, despite historical evidence, how do they explain sort of the own historical evidence of the Quran requiring this purge by fire? I don't know. Something a little interesting there. What was that?
That was a monopoly.
Yeah, right, yeah, exactly. Okay. So another thing that people use here is the time difference between the event and the writing. The idea being the earlier you put pen to paper, as it were, the more likely your memory is solid and you're going to write down the correct thing. Events and writing. Okay, so for Alexander the Great, we have a few centuries. Okay. And again, so this feels wildly, bizarre to us. Why would no one write it down for hundreds of years? But again, in the culture of ancient documents, this is quite normal. A lot of times, things are just communicated orally, or a lot of people couldn't read and write anyway, and so they just didn't bother to write everything down the way we do. So having a couple centuries between Alexander the Great's life and when someone bothered to write it down is fairly normal for ancient documents. This is not crazy. The Bible, now this is going to be a little bit contentious, but I'm going to say a few decades. Now, a lot of biblical critics don't believe that, and they think the Bible was not written until maybe, say, 300 AD or so. And we're going to have a big thing in a second. I'm going to erase this, and we're going to have a whole thing explaining why I think that is unlikely. Okay, but just to get it on the board, this is one of the criteria used by historians. Yeah, since the board is full, I'm going to have to erase it. Any questions about anything on here so far? All good? Okay. Are we enjoying the lack of math in this so far? I guess I had one number, but no mathematical.
Yeah, I was hoping for more.
Yeah. Okay. Continuing then, the fourth criteria used by historians is first-hand accounts. Right. So this would be the people who actually saw the event either write it or provide testimony to the account. Now, of course, obviously, Alexander the Great, no. It happened again centuries later. No one's living for centuries in order to write this down or provide their account. So obviously that's no. The Bible, again, I'm going to say yes. Now this will again sort of controversial in the same reason why the time period is, but I mean at the very least we have examples in the Bible of them claiming this at least, right? Like Luke saying, I went and Luke 1, I went and interviewed people and I collected the account, and this is what happened, right? So at the very least, the Bible is claiming it. So we're going to analyze in a little bit whether that seems likely or not. But again, just for the sake of explaining the criteria, this is something historians put a lot of value on. It's people who actually see it tell about it, right? Okay, historical accuracy. So this would be like, do the things it's talking about sort of comport with what we know about history, or is it creating some kind of narrative or story that seems wildly at odds with what we know about history? Okay. Now, for Alexander the Great, I mean, it seems like, yes, like I said, there's no big controversy about his life and the things he did. We all basically agree that it matches archaeological evidence we've unearthed about the Greek Empire. It seems fine. Oh, sorry, one thing I forgot to mention about the Bible, the number of copies, surprisingly, is growing. And not fast, but the reason is people are still finding manuscripts in like old ancient libraries that have been uncatalogued of the Bible. Like it's, stuck between two pages of a book, or it's shoved in somewhere. So I said 25,000 or so. Yeah, that number is still growing slowly, but they're still finding old copies of manuscripts in libraries that they didn't know they had. So that's interesting. And the Bible, in a similar vein, is, yes, I'd say, and again, growing. Let me give you a couple examples. So, one thing I had mentioned about, we don't, ascribe to this God of the gaps idea, right? Which is like, well, I don't know how this works, so we'll just, say it's God. But what I find is the opposite is often sort of used as a criticism of Christianity. So people will say like, well, the Bible talks about this thing in history, and we don't have any evidence of that, so there just must be no, the Bible's wrong. But again, this, I think, historically has proved to be a very dangerous way of thinking, because the Bible keeps being proven correct in its historical analysis. Let me give you a couple examples. The first one is a somewhat minor one, but I'll mention it to start us off, is the character of Pontius Pilate. Okay, the Bible talks about him as the governor, right, of Judea. And for a while, no one believed he existed. And they, until they found additional evidence of him existing, right? Inscriptions sort of in stone they pulled out of, the Jerusalem and things like that. And so, again, for anyone who claims, well, the Bible made up this governor of Judea, suddenly they had to say, oh, whoops, okay, I guess it's fine. My favorite one, though, is the Hittite Empire. So if you recall in the Old Testament, it talks about this big empire of the Hittites. And again, for millennia, people thought the Bible was crazy. Because they said, oh, it talks about this huge empire. If there was such a thing, if there's such a big empire, we would have found archaeological evidence of this. And we have not found anything over millennia. Until finally, in the late 1800s, early 1900s, they found a massive empire in southern Turkey. Huge, just like dwarfing anything that was sort of in the surrounding area. And so then they're like, oh, whoops, I guess the Bible was correct then, right? And again, you can go, research that. It's pretty fascinating how they discovered it. But again, the point I'd say is the Bible seems not only like it comports with what we understand about history, but it's given us a pretty compelling and interesting roadmap for things maybe we should start, trying to discover, because it seems like it keeps coming up true, right? So if there's other empires in the Bible that we don't know about, maybe we should go digging in those areas. We might find something pretty cool. Because it seems like it sort of keeps coming up. I like that one a lot, just because again, sort of like the Dead Sea Scrolls, there was for millennia people kept making these claims, and then eventually, sort of, and this is also why I say, contrary to the pop culture idea, science is not disproving God, it's constantly reinforcing it. And this is another area, right? Sort of archaeological science and advancement, right? It's continually demonstrating the truthfulness of the Bible, not refuting it. Okay. Final one here would be the attestation of extra biblical sources. Or I can just say maybe, I'll say other sources, because this is sort of comparing not just the Bible, other sources, right? So this would be our other works talking about these sorts of things as well. And, for Alexander the Great, he is mentioned, so we presume he's a real person. And the Bible, again, is yes. Right? We have a couple very common examples of people talking about the things that the Bible also talked about, even though they're sort of, not the same group. They're not Christians, basically, right? So, for example, we have the Jewish scholar Josephus. Okay, so he was a very prominent Jewish scholar, historian, wrote down all kinds of stuff that we...
Is that, Flavius? Josephus Flavius or something like that?
I don't know. That sounds a very Roman name.
Yeah,
I
can't remember. Sorry.
Yeah, I'm not sure. And then there's also a guy named Tacitus, who is a Roman historian, writing down a ton of stuff. So again, these guys, they don't say, oh, by the way, Jesus is God, right? But they talk about Jesus and the disciples and the things they did and the events that happened. And again, they have no skin in the game, so to speak, right? There's no reason for them to lie. They're not a Christian. They don't believe in the divine claims of Jesus, but they still believe that the, historical evidence of the things he did, the places he went, his disciples, what they did, is all true, and they write about it, okay? Okay, any questions about that again before I erase it?
I've heard that there's historical evidence for the flood as well, other cultures like Egypt and even Japan and stuff have records of a worldwide flood. Yeah,
that's true. Basically every sort of ancient culture has some story, some legend, about the earth being flooded. So again, hard to know exactly what that is, but it's very interesting and intriguing that it seems like everyone from around sort of that old or ancient era is sort of talking about a worldwide flood. So very, very interesting.
It is Flavius. It's I don't know how to pronounce it.
Sure, yeah.
Flavius Josephus.
Okay.
And it says how he's a manuscript called Antiquities of the Jews.
There you go, yeah. Right.
First century historian, around 93, 94 AD.
There you go, right.
I just right.
Yeah. Perfect, yeah. So very contemporary guy, right? So he's writing about them before the turn of the century. Mm-hmm. Sorry, very, very contemporary. Okay. So let me erase this then.
Can I just say, I find this very interesting because I don't want to be too judgy, but the thing, what I find significant is, well, because there's so many manuscripts existing, I didn't actually realize it was that many. When you talk about other manuscripts like the Quran, and you said how they're hiding the previous pre-purge ones and all that, it's almost you hear how the Mormons, Joseph Smith came out with his book in the 1800s and all that. Just to use that as an example, it's almost like that's just a mere statistical error. That it's a different version of whatever, right? Yeah. So, it's one thing to say, here's the Bible and this is how many copies we have. Okay, well, we're going to change that a bit and add on to it or disprove it, or no, there's actually, this is the real story. That, those others are the statistical errors. It's completely opposite to the other ones.
Yeah. One of 25,000 is like a rounding error. Just say one is correct, 25,000 are wrong.
Really?
Yeah. So one thing I'm going to do here is I'm going to mention maybe some non-historical criteria, and these are actually sort of my favorite, but these are not really criteria that historians will exactly use, but I think tells us a lot about the Bible. So when you think about it, the Bible is a really unique book because of how it was written and composed, and essentially because it was written and put together by people across millennia, right? And not only across millennia, by people of very different socioeconomic status, of very different cultures, living in very different areas and times of the world, right? We have obviously thinking of Moses at the very least, penning the original books of the Bible, in exile, even he's a prince of Egypt, becoming an exile, becoming a leader. You've got obviously kings, King David, King Solomon. You've got again exiles to Babylon, Daniel, people writing. You've got 4 downtrodden prophets like Jeremiah. You've got basically all kinds of from kings to paupers, from Egyptian culture to Babylonian culture to sort of Canaanite culture to finally sort of this Israeli culture kind of emerges, right? But think about this for a second. Try to get how many people wrote the Bible? 30, 40, try to get 30, 40 people anywhere in the world today to agree on what's really important about things. You'll have a pretty hard time, I think. Even if it's within, maybe even this church, they probably will agree on, the importance of this Bible. But, this city, this country, this world, to go from Canada, from China, Russia, Ukraine, get them in the same room, right? Let's see if we can figure out what's important, right? You will not get agreement. Okay. Now stretch that across millennia. Are people really going to agree on the fundamental importance of things of this world? No, they won't, or we can't even get it now, let alone across time and culture and everything else. So why are, again, the kings in the Bible and the paupers agreeing about what's important? Right? This is not usually how it goes, right? If you look sort of across history, kings usually write about how they have the divine right to do anything they want, and everyone else is like their subhuman property. And the poor people typically write about sort of, the workers' revolution, overthrow, the rights, okay? These are very groups in opposition. But again, this is not what we see in the Bible. We see the king and the slave writing the same thing, right? This is really, really weird. And so the things I would say, right, is that and this is very unique about the Bible because the time period over is written and the number of people involved. This is not really like any other book. You think of, again, the Quran it wasn't written by Muhammad because he was illiterate, but it was sort of just about his life, right? So a very short period of time by about one person in one little area, okay? Again, Book of Mormon, who also Joseph Smith was illiterate, but anyway, again, one person, small geographical region across a small period of time. The Bible is kind of the only example we have of something like this, which is written across so vast a period of time by so many different people. The fact that it's telling a cohesive message, I mean, it boggles the mind. How could that be? So this is sort of actually one of my favorite examples of the accuracy of the Bible. It's just because it has this accuracy across millennia, cultures, socioeconomic status, and look to me, like I really struggle to find either a non-divine answer for this, or again, near divine cabal that has orchestrated this whole thing across millennia, right? And that has such power to enforce this kind of, again, union of all these people. I don't know how you would even describe it. And again, interesting, I think I mentioned over Christmas, I was talking to my brother-in-law, who's a very ardent atheist, and he surprisingly used this as an argument against the Bible. Well, look, it was written by all these different people. But again, I don't believe this doesn't make any sense, because again, if you ever have like a contemporary science textbook, one thing you'll note, of course, is that just a lot of scientists contribute to it, right? It rarely is it a science textbook written by one person. Usually, it's different people are contributing their thing. It's edited and reviewed and double checked, and so the idea of multiple people coming together, lending their specialties to a book is not crazy to begin with. But again, across this millennia, culture and socioeconomic status, it's just it boggles the mind, like I said. And the other one, again, similar to sort of this time thing, is prophecy. Right? So there were prophecies made in the Bible that came true, again, millennia later. And again, this is very different, again, from, say, the Book of Mormon, where Joseph Smith made prophecies, and then they, came true very shortly thereafter. Or, I will note, he made prophecies that even today, the Mormon Church have now abandoned, right? Because they're like, I guess this one just won't ever come true. So again, calls into question the ability of a prophet who makes errors, but anyway. So now, but again, the time gap of the Bible is what makes this significant. Because a prophecy made and then fulfilled like a year later, it's not really that strong a prophecy, right? A prophecy made and then fulfilled 3,000 years later, when no one could have conceivably ever cared or remembered it. That's amazing, right? And again, there's so many prophecies about Jesus throughout the Old Testament about who he would be and what he would do, in addition to all kinds of other things, right? About the nation of Israel and things like that. That, again, it's the time difference that makes it so astounding. Because if it was within one person's life, they made some bold claim, maybe they could do something to make it happen, right? Maybe, or their followers could. But hundreds, thousands of years later, really, really unlikely, right? And so one interesting thing to think about this too is like when Jesus was in Capernaum, one thing he said, woe to you people of Capernaum, because if Sodom and Gomorrah had seen what I've shown you today, they would have repented, right? So it would be better for them on the judgment day than you, because if essentially saying, if I had gone to Sodom and Gomorrah, they would have repented when they saw these miracles. Right? And this story actually tells us like two interesting things. One is, I think I mentioned this idea that God knows not only what has happened, what will happen, but what could happen, all possible realities, right? Jesus, if he wasn't speaking metaphorically, is basically saying, I know what would have happened had situations been different. So again, it speaks to God's omniscience. But what it also shows, I think, is something interesting too, is that, let us say that, okay, Genesis 1 through, I can't remember when Sodom and Gomorrah happened, was fairly early, right? 15, 16, somewhere. Or no, after Abraham 16. Anyway, it's early, right? First half of Genesis. So, there have been maybe a couple prophecies, right? And then Jesus is on the scene, Sodom and Gomorrah are saved, I guess, by Jesus, whatever, they repent. And then now there's no more prophecy, basically, right? So we get a couple chapters of Genesis worth of prophecy, Jesus comes, fulfill it, the end. But the benefit we have of the Bible now is not that we have a couple chapters of prophecy that, were fulfilled a couple of years later, right? It's that we have all kinds of prophecies that took millennia to be fulfilled, right? Again, this is really unique and really compelling, I think. So again, it's that time distance between when it was written and when these things were fulfilled that really makes you, to me at least, really wonder. And I believe it was, I think if I got it right, it was C.S. Lewis who said, this is the most compelling evidence for the Bible, for Christianity, that people wrote something thousands of years, prior to Jesus ever, being born, and then they were all fulfilled in one person. And I can't remember who this was. Someone has, or maybe multiple people, have calculated the odds that Jesus could have fulfilled all the prophecies about himself. And I don't know how they exactly calculate the odds of that happening, I suppose, but essentially, as you may imagine, the odds are like just essentially zero, right? That he would have been born in the right place, die in the right way, right? Do all these things. Again, if you don't believe it was divine providence, you would have to assume it was, again, some shadowy cabal over millennia orchestrating events that, I guess Joseph and Mary were a part of, and they convinced Jesus to be a part of it and how he had to act in order to fulfill this millennia-long conspiracy, right?
The bloodline of Jesus.
Right, like it doesn't really make sense, okay? But these are kind of the only options. In light of sort of this strong, compelling, again, evidence over time, I think the time is what gives us such power. It's either, it seems to me, it's either God or, some all-powerful shadowy cabal. I just don't see a third option to explain how this could be.
It's the Pentaverate.
Yeah, sure. Or the lizard man, I don't know, there's all kinds of things there, but so any questions about this one then? The non-historical,
So actually, okay, so this is super interesting. So how does one explain the controversy? I mean, this is a classic one, right? Of a number of the books being written decades after Jesus apparently died.
Mm-hmm.
As far as like, okay, he's no longer on this earth, he's up there.
Yeah.
But these people are writing the books 50 years later, and then of course it's well, how do you know what happened? You don't know because it's 50 years later. He's not even here right now.
Well, that's an interesting question. Although I think if anyone is saying exactly that, they've already demonstrated essentially the truth of what I'm trying to say here, because the actual objection is not that they're writing it 50 years later, it's that they're writing it 300 years later.
Yeah.
So anyone who acknowledges it was 50 years, I think, I don't know, the argument's already over.
Yeah.
Because they've done what we kind of need to show. For ancient documents, that is astoundingly, accurate, right?
They're just proving it.
Right.
Yeah.
So for anyone with that
Fair
particular,
enough, not much more to be said.
Yeah. So let me do a couple things here, and let me do that one now. Then this idea that the New Testament was objection to the Bible, that the New Testament was written long after the events depicted. Okay. So like objection. New Testament was written long after Jesus. So again, this is speaking to that historical criteria, right, of first-hand accounts, of the time difference, and possibly even, again, sort of, I suppose you could argue, well, it's more, it's an easier thing to have it be accurate amongst itself because anyone who would have objected to what was written is now long dead, hundreds of years ago. So now only the people who are intentionally corrupting it are even alive to do it, I guess. Could be an argument. But let's look at it. Okay, so what we're going to look at basically is does our historical understanding of the time period and what's written in the Bible indicate that it would have been written at the time it says or later? And so let's see some things. Number one. So in 64 AD, Rome burned to the ground, right? This big, massive, the Great Fire of Rome, okay? And, we sort of have this sort of famous caricature of Nero playing the fiddle while Rome burns, right? Emperor Nero. So interestingly, okay, so Great Fire in Rome happened in 68 AD. Great Fire in Rome, 64 AD, I believe. But in 68 AD, Nero blamed this on Christians. Okay, so again, this is all very well understood, right? Not a controversial thing. Blamed this on Christians. So now, think about this for a second. Jesus is essentially dead for 30 years. Okay. According to the objector, the Bible has not been written for hundreds of years. And yet, there are so many Christians in Rome as to serve as a scapegoat for this giant fire. It's a little weird, right? Why are there so many? There's not a single thing written about Jesus for hundreds of years yet. and yet he's attracted so many ardent followers as to be a convenient scapegoat for the emperor. It's a little weird, right? It doesn't really make sense. We have some, another one. Tacitus, who I mentioned, the Roman historian, writes in 116 AD, Christians are rampant in Rome. So again, like, if the Bible is not written until 300 or so AD, and again, even at that time, relying on a corruption of the truth, why would there be, again, this is 70 years or so, 80 years after Jesus, why are they so numerous in Rome as to be described as rampant? Again, like, this doesn't really make sense, I would say, right? The Bible is, again, not written for hundreds of years. Why are there so many?
How many religions were there at that time? Like when you're saying Christians made up this big number, like what other?
Well, there would have been Judaism, but probably not that many in Rome. They tended to be a somewhat insular group. Of course, they had the Roman pantheon, and sort of the Greek pantheon would have been probably the most common religion. I mean, they did essentially believe it at the time, right? There were a couple others. I always mess up the pronunciation, but Zoroastrianism.
Yep, that's right.
Right. Yeah. Okay.
It's a weird one.
Yeah. Which is sort of Persian kind of originated. Some people, just on the topic, think that the wise men who came to Jesus were Zoroastrian scholars who studied the stars, and that's how they knew about Jesus. But yeah, those would have, the Roman pantheon would have been certainly the dominant one, because again, there wasn't a ton of sort of cross-cultural, intermingling. I mean, more so in the Roman Empire than others, because they had a very complex, road system. But yeah, essentially that would have been the common one, if that answers your question. Yeah. Okay. There's a lot of interesting omissions from the Bible that tell us, I think, a great deal about the time period. So let's think about this. So again, not a silver bullet, but just something interesting to consider. Another kind of thing in the balance of weighing the probability of this being correct or not. Okay. All right. Let's think about this. Okay. So A to start here. James, the brother of Jesus, died in 62 AD, as recorded by Josephus. James, the brother of Jesus, died in 62 AD. So 2 years before the Great Fire, recorded by, again, Josephus, right? So not a Christian, right? So no reason to, make anything up. Josephus, okay? He's one of the leaders of the Jerusalem church, right? Very, very important guy, okay? The Bible does not mention his death, okay? Yet, James the Apostle his death is mentioned. James the Apostle's death is mentioned. I believe this is Acts 12. I think. I have that right. I'll put it 12. I think. In 44 AD. The Bible doesn't mention the year, but I think this is basically commonly understood. Okay, so the Bible is not averse to mentioning the death of church leaders. These are guys, very both big important guys. James died in 44 AD. It is mentioned. James, the brother of Jesus, a very important fellow, dies 18 years later, but unmentioned. Maybe because it hadn't happened yet. Right? This would be my contention. Right? The Bible is perfectly fine mentioning the death of James the Apostle and others, right? In Acts, there's a lot of people dying in Acts, right? And they mention them. Yet James, the brother of Jesus, he's not mentioned at all. Well, again, I would say probably it hadn't been written yet. So I would contend that the book of Acts was written after 44 AD, obviously has to, and before 62 AD. And that's why the fate of James, the brother of Jesus, is just not mentioned at all. Right? You would think, again, if this was written many, many years later, they could have mentioned it. They probably would have. Why not? There's two Jameses. That's a nice symmetry. That's good. James, brother Jesus, James the Apostle. Okay, see another one. In Matthew 24, Jesus prophesied that the temple would be destroyed. Right? And of course, this was like, very controversial thing for him to say, right? Because of course, obviously, the temple was the symbol of Jewish culture and religion, and obviously tied into their ancestors. Right. Temple would be destroyed. Would be destroyed. And it was in 70 AD. Again, unmentioned in the Bible. Wouldn't you think? So this is like, one of the certainly most controversial prophecies Jesus made, right? It really made people angry to say the temple would be destroyed. And yet, so if the Bible was written after that, you think they would have said, look at this bold prophecy Jesus made. It came true. Therefore, we should all follow Jesus. Because look, obviously he's the Son of God. He got this right. Unmentioned. That's weird. That's pretty weird. You think he would mention that, right? That's like one of the biggest prophecies.
In fact, if there were more editions, second edition, third edition,
Right.
something like that could have been added.
Yes, right. Yeah.
Been.
Very, very good point. Exactly. Right. They could have added that in. So again, talking about the corruption, that would have been a good one. Because then people all would have been, familiar with it then, right?
That one is kind of bizarre. Like just the fact that it wasn't even said.
Yeah. Yeah.
Hmm.
And because again, right, the Bible is not averse to pointing out when prophecies are being fulfilled, right? They all say like, as had been said, right? Like to fulfill the word of the Lord, right? You see this language in there. So again, the Bible is not, some mysterious book that, only leaves clues and never fills us in. It constantly fills us in about prophecy. This one is not mentioned. That's strange. See, the fate of Paul also unmentioned. What happened to him? He's in jail, right? In Romans. What happened? Right? According to some sort of, church, history, they think, maybe he was able to make his appeal to Caesar, but no one knows really, right? Because it's unmentioned. He was basically the main character of the book of Acts, right? And a good friend of the author, Luke.
Doesn't the book of Acts just end?
It just ends. That's right. Exactly. It just ends. So yeah, I'll put that too. That's very good, right? Yeah, the book of Acts, it just ends very abruptly. Almost as if the acts done to that point were now finished, right? There's no more acts to write about. Right? So again, right, your main character, his fate is unknown. The book just ends unceremoniously. That's it. That's weird. That's really weird, right? Again, Paul is, in a lot of ways, one of the central figures of the whole New Testament, let alone just the book of Acts. You think people want to know what happened to him, right? Just no mention. Because again, maybe it hadn't happened yet. Okay? So I think, again, these are not the silver bullet, obviously now we all believe 100%. But I think they're really interesting things to think about, right? If the Bible really was not written until it's in 300 AD, is sort of often the time period mentioned, a lot of these things just don't make a lot of sense to me. So I think it really calls into question this idea that it was written so long after. If that was true, I don't think we would see these things. Any questions about this one then? All good. Okay, so let's look at maybe the first one. Objections. The Bible. So this, I guess this is one of them, I suppose, but there's some other ones too. Basically saying, people reasons they give for the Bible not to be trusted. Okay. So this one would be Bible is culturally irrelevant. And so the objection would essentially go like, the Bible, again, was written in a time, in a place that maybe it made sense for the people of the time, but now, we are much more enlightened 2,000 years later, and we know better. And so it just doesn't, nothing relevant to say about our culture today, nothing relevant to say about what is important to us now, what we know now about morality and truth, and perhaps they would even say science, okay? But, truth doesn't change, right? If something is true, it's true. This is what we look at, this sort of the hierarchy of truth, right? Something is true, it does not change. So, people wouldn't ever say truth is culturally irrelevant, right? Something is true or it's not. And so the idea of it being, this cultural handbook is just missing the point of the Bible. The Bible is not a cultural handbook. That's not its purpose, right? If anything, the Bible is countercultural in the whole thing, basically, right? It's constantly saying how people's culture has gone astray and people should come back to God, right? It's basically telling over and over again the culture of the day of what, for whatever the book was written, is wrong, right? Almost every time, right? Also, counterculture. So whether it's the Egyptian culture is wrong, the Canaanite culture is wrong, the Israelite culture is wrong for their many disobedience to God, the Persian culture is wrong. I mean, really over and over again. Every culture is wrong. It's bringing it back to God, every time back to God. So if someone looked at the Bible today and said, well, this seems very countercultural, I won't believe it. But the Bible's doing its job then. That's purpose, right? Is to bring people away from cultural sort of norms and to God. But yeah, fundamentally, truth doesn't change. So looking at it as a cultural handbook is just the wrong way to look at it. Let's see here. Oh yes, okay. Next objection would be that the disciples were just trying to start a religion. Right? So this is sort of like, they're sort of, charismatic cult leaders, and their goal was just make a religion. Okay, so it wasn't about trying to be true or anything like that. They just wanted to start a religion. A religion. Okay. And again, this has some degree of cultural understanding because we see this kind of come up, right? Whether from sort of ostensibly religion, real religion, even something like maybe Scientology, which has the trappings of religion, I suppose. Mormonism, right? He basically started, one man basically said, I'm starting a new religion or new correcting religion, I guess you could say. But even, you can imagine sort of like pseudo cult figures or charismatic leaders, maybe not even if they label them a religion, but we get this sort of idea that some people do this kind of thing. Let's think about this though. So, in the Bible, the disciples are portrayed horribly, right? I mean, at best, they're kind of like bumbling maroons, right? At worst, they're like actively interfering with Jesus, right? Of course, Peter says you would never let Jesus, die, and Jesus said, "You get behind me, Satan." He, slashed the Roman centurion's ear off, and Jesus had to heal it, right? Like, again, at best, they just are kind of bumbling around. They keep getting Jesus to ask them questions they don't know, okay? But at worst, they're like basically actively interfering with what Jesus is doing. Why would they put those stories in, right? I mean, again, if you read the accounts of Joseph Smith, there's no embarrassing stories of Joseph Smith or, L. Ron Hubbard, right? Even the stories that seem embarrassing, they somehow turned into some grandiose thing, like how, just off the top of my head, L. Ron Hubbard had to do like an insane amount of drugs and alcohol to understand the mysteries of the universe. But again, this is portrayed as a positive. Of course, that was what he had to do. So why would they do that, right? So if the story of Peter walking on the water and then sinking, if they were really trying to start a religion, you think they just keep the first half. He walks on the water. He's like semi-divine. He's, look at his face. But no, they put the part in where he got scared and fell into the water. Okay. Or you think of, Peter, he couldn't withstand the scrutiny of a little girl. at Jesus' trial, right? They're like, oh, don't I know you? Right? You were with them. And he's like, no, right? I don't know this Jesus, right? So this is like the leader of the church, right? Jesus said, like, on whom I will, build my rock. And yet, again, a little girl comes up to him and he buckles. Like, why would they put that story in there? It makes him look horrible. Why? You wouldn't say, oh, yeah, look, I fell in the water. I couldn't withstand the scrutiny of a little girl. And now you should all come follow me because I'm starting a new religion. No, right? That's not how it goes. If you look at other religions, it goes, look at all these amazing things I did. I'm wonderful. I'm amazing. I'm like basically God. You should come follow me, right? Not the reverse. The disciples are portrayed horribly. Women are the first to see the risen Christ. So I think we just had a sermon about this recently, right? Talking about the value of women in the society, which were like 0. I think this is the Easter message, right? To see Christ. Jonathan was talking about this. In the culture of the time, the testimony of a woman was worth very, very little, right? Essentially nothing. If you only had women, it was essentially worth nothing. No one should believe it according to the law. Okay, but there were no men when they went to see Jesus at first. It was only women. So if you were trying to start a religion, why would you pick your key witnesses for that moment to be women? Because what you're basically inviting people to do that is dismiss your account. Unless it was true. That's the only reason you would have to put that down. If you're trying to start a religion, this is a really, really bad idea.
That's quite powerful.
Yeah. And you'll notice in sort of what they call the pseudepigraphal gospel, like one sort of attributed to people, in the Gospel of Peter, it's men who go to see the Christ. And also a giant glowing neon cross comes out of the tomb and all kinds of fun stuff. But you'll notice that someone, what you're trying to say, made the second edition and said, this doesn't make any sense. No one's going to buy that. Women, let me change it. Men did it. Well, and just to make it clear, we'll have a big glowing cross. Also, just on that note, because there are these other gospel people talk about, right? Gospel of Peter, Gospel of Thomas. And one very interesting thing about it is that people have analyzed a lot of things about the content of it from a historical perspective. And for example, they have looked at the names of the characters in these gospels. Those names didn't exist at the time, right? So obviously someone just wrote it based on like the cultural norms of year 300, 400, whatever it was, and constructed a narrative and put in names that were common at the time that didn't exist then. So this is evidence of how we can actually dismiss some of these, again, sort of pseudepigraphal false gospels, because the things they're talking about just didn't make any sense in the cultural context. So there's a little just kind of aside for you there. But yes, so women were the first to see Christ. 3. Why did they die for a lie? Okay, so if the contention is that they knew it was wrong, they knew it was a lie, they were just trying to start a religion, why would they die for it? Right? This is not like someone believes in some cause with all their heart and they're willing to sacrifice their life. This is, ostensibly, they know it's a lie and they're going to start a religion. Well, if they know it's a lie, what? And someone's going to kill you for it. That any material gain you might have been able to accrue is about to be lost. You could just recant. But they didn't. They were perfectly willing to die for what the objector says is a lie. That's crazy. No one would do that. If you know it's a lie, just recant. Yeah, it was a joke. I was confused. It was a lie. Anything, right? No one would die for something they know is a lie, right? That doesn't make any sense. So okay, that's that one. Any questions about these ones so far? Okay. Another objection. Basically, the Bible was written by people who didn't understand science. So again, coming back to this sort of idea. And they'll say, the objector in this case will say things like, oops, we didn't understand science. When Lazarus died and Jesus rose him from the dead, they only thought he died because they didn't know how to take a pulse. Okay, so basically the contention is that people back then didn't know the difference between someone being alive and dead. And so Lazarus, coming out of the tomb, they were just confused because they didn't know how to check the pulse and see if he's actually dead. They're just throwing people in tombs, apparently. Okay? So again, my thing I love to say, C.S. Lewis calls this chronological snobbery. To imagine that these people were such fools, barely conscious, sentient fools, that they didn't know the difference between life and death is really, really arrogant. And again, the reason it's mentioned in the Bible is, if it was something they didn't understand, again, I think Jonathan mentioned this in the Easter thing as well, right? No one ever talked about people coming back from the dead. It was never ever mentioned. But if it was just a regular thing, because they couldn't tell the difference between life and death, you would see that all the time. It wouldn't be a shocking thing. When Jesus did it, no one would be like surprised. They'd be like, oh yeah, I can see, It wouldn't even be a story worth writing down, because it happens all the time, go walking out of tombs, right? They keep getting it wrong. It was the fact that they did know the difference, and that this was unusual, that made it something profound. Or another thing they'll say is, Mary wasn't a virgin. They didn't know how babies were made. Which, again, a little bit of chronological snobbery, I think here. I think they probably they didn't know the process of meiosis and cellular division, but I think they got the basic plot of how babies were made, right? I think that saying otherwise is really, really arrogant. Okay. And again, right, fundamentally, the Bible is not a science textbook. It doesn't matter if people who wrote it didn't understand quantum mechanics, because it's not telling us about quantum mechanics, so it's irrelevant. And I think at the end of last class, I think you were asking about how the time period of the Earth being made or something like that, right? And I was saying, no one was there, right? God essentially told Moses, this is what to write. So whether Moses could have been the dumbest man on the planet, right? But if God is saying, write it down like this, because this is how I want it to be conveyed, well, that's fine then, because God isn't confused by science. So it the Bible isn't talking about science to begin with, but even if it were, the contention doesn't make sense within sort of the context of the Bible, the sort of internal consistency. I think, did we look at that already? Internal consistency? Maybe that's coming up. Anyway, do you guys recall? Did we talk about that already?
Not yet.
Right, okay. Oh, you did?
No, we didn't.
Oh, we did. Sorry. Okay. So yeah, within the context of sort of we'll get into it, the narrative of the Bible, God telling people how things are and then writing it down is basically what we should expect, right? It's actually the reverse. Someone saying, I'm so smart, and so let me write this down. That's what we should be suspicious about. But again, we don't see that. So claiming that people didn't understand science is missing the point of the Bible. Okay, let's see here. Any questions about this before I erase it? Well, good. So now let's look at one that is one you'll hear probably often, which is the Bible is contradictory. So people will say, well, look at this, here the Bible says this, over here the Bible says that, therefore the Bible is contradictory, and you shouldn't believe it. Contradictory. Okay. So, for example, they'll say something like, well, how did Judas die? Because in one place it says he hung himself, and another place it says that, he fell and his gut spilled out over the ground and he died. Okay. The contradiction. The Bible's true. Why does it have the contradiction? Okay. It can't be true. However, we need to consider something, which is that, again, this is kind of like I was saying about Alexander the Great, right? Or us here, Maple Baptist Church, a rich church. Contradiction? Well, no, you just don't, there's some missing context there, right? And so, two statements which can be complementary, shouldn't automatically be taken as contradictory. And let me tell you two things about that. Shouldn't automatically be taken as contradictory. Okay. Or another example is that, there's a story about the life of Jesus where this Roman officer comes to him and says, my servant is sick. Can you come please heal him? And then later on says, actually, don't bother because just say the word and he'll be healed. Okay. But another account, it's not the officer that comes to talk to him, it's like the servant. So again, contradiction, right? Who went to talk to Jesus? Okay. But again, like the thing is, I think this objection, first of all, we're going to see a bunch of ways in which it fails. But first of all, this is just not honest, intellectually honest. So, for example, one time I got a parking ticket, and it was given to me by the city of Coquitlam. Now, if I say the city of Coquitlam gave me a parking ticket, we don't think that the city became personified and walked over to me and handed me a ticket. We understand it was an agent of the city. So again, in this case, did the Roman officer talk to Jesus? Well, it was someone perhaps under his authority. So whether it was him or a servant, we understand that. We get it. We understand what this means. We use the same language today when talking about getting a parking ticket, right? The city did not become personified. It was an agent. Was it the officer? Was it a servant? It doesn't really matter, right? So we use this like intense, intellectually dishonest level of scrutiny for the Bible that we don't apply to anything else in life. Another example is I often just, for whatever reason, I drive a van typically because we have for the kids in the car seats, But I'll say like, kids, let's go to the car. And one time my daughter even said, Daddy, why do you call it a car? It's a van. I said, I don't know. It's just habit, right? I mean, vehicle, right? But again, like, so if that were in the Bible, they'd be like, contradiction, was it a car or a van? It's like, we get it. There's like this kind of cultural context. Car sometimes means vehicle or whatever. Like, we kind of get it, right? So what it's saying is two statements that can be complementary. You shouldn't automatically be taken as contradictory, okay? And we see a couple examples in sort of just normal life, but a couple people have commented on this as well, including one guy who's not a Christian, okay? So you may have heard a guy named Bart Ehrman, okay? He used to be a Christian, now he's not. Probably the most prolific biblical critic of the day right now. And even he admits this, like, if two things in the Bible seem contradictory, but there's a plausible explanation for how they actually complement each other, you should probably just assume that's how it is, right? So this is a very strict biblical critic saying if two things seem contradictory but can be explained, you should probably accept the explanation is probably true. Okay. Let's see here. There's another fellow, J. Warner Wallace. Okay. J. Warner Wallace. He wrote a book called Cold Case Christianity. So again, not a Christian. And that he tells the story. His wife wanted to go to church. I think it was because they wanted to raise their kids to have some moral backing or everything. But fine, whatever, we'll go to church. And so the first day in church, the pastor said, Jesus was the smartest man who ever lived. Which I guess is true. I don't think I've ever really heard Jesus described as smart before, like wise, maybe, but smart. But anyway, so J. Warner Wallace said, well, if Jesus was so smart, then I should be able to analyze the Bible, right, rigorously, intellectually. And so he was a cold case detective in California. And when he looked at the accounts of the Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, which have some differences, right, the fact that they were different struck him not as contradiction, right, but that way of authentic. Because he knew as a cold case detective, when you interview people, if four people have the exact same word for word story, this is not consistency, this is collusion. Right? It was the fact that they were a little bit different. To him had, yes, that ring of authenticity and made him believe, this actually probably is true. Because if they were all saying the same thing, he would think that was a conspiracy, right? Collusion.
His YouTube channel.
Okay.
It's pretty good, actually. It talks about as a detective, what happens inside the room and what happens outside.
Right. Yeah.
It's very interesting.
Yeah. He's really, really, really interesting guy. Cold Case Christianity. He has a big website too with all this kind of stuff on it too. But again, right, it's just really not a standard we apply to anything. So, for example, if I was telling someone about this, a day, and I was like, oh yeah, we were in the basement of the church when we were, someone would say, well, hold on, it wasn't the basement. I can see this ground floor out there. You're not in the basement. It's like, okay, well, fine. But yeah, it was down some stairs, you had to get there, it's the lowest floor of the church. But the thing is, if you really wanted two statements to be in complete accordance with one another, and no omitted details, you basically would need like a quantum snapshot of the universe and like, the subatomic position of every particle. Because now you have a complete picture. Aside from that, there's always going to be missing information. Okay, so I was teaching, in the church basement, and it was kind of warm in here. And so I said, well, what was the temperature? Why didn't you say the temperature? What was the weather forecast? Right? You're leaving out details. Why are you omitting details? What are you trying to hide? Right? But it's like, no, like you just can't. The Bible is a fixed length. It cannot tell everything in exhaustive detail. It's just not possible. So there will be omitted details, like in every account. And again, right, we don't do this with anything, even a court of law. Right? We don't expect our courts to operate like this either. So again, it's a standard that we don't apply to anything else. So again, I just say it's intellectually dishonest. And again, even biblical critics basically agree with that. Cold case detectives think, that's all fine. Okay, I think we're basically coming up on the end pretty quick here. Okay, so I think, last couple things, okay. Very quickly. This idea of, as I mentioned, internal consistency. Okay, internal consistency is a sort of concept of logic or math where do the things make sense within the context of the things it's talking about? To give you an example, there was one of my professors at the university told the story of how this mathematician, I think it was Bertrand Russell, he was writing a textbook, math textbook about set theory, doesn't matter what that is, and it was beautiful, amazing, long, thick volume, brilliantly written. He sent it to a friend to review it. The friend said, it's amazing, it's so well argued, it's perfect, except you made a problem in your assumption. So you assumed the wrong thing, and so everything you concluded after that was perfectly logical. But you made a problem in the assumption, so everything's actually wrong. And so there's a bit of a difference here, right? So there's, when you're examining anything, you have your assumptions, which sort of undergird the start, and then sort of all the things that sort of follow, these sort of demonstrations to follow, we'll call it, okay? So in this case, the demonstrations were perfectly logical, followed all the right rules of math, but his assumption was wrong. And so in any sort of worldview, we can kind of break it into these two parts. So for example, you could ask someone, is the Bible true? They may say, no. But you could say, is the Bible internally consistent? Does the thing, given the assumption that God exists, and this is his character, does the things the Bible tells us then about God and reality seem to comport within itself, right? Now, they could not believe the Bible, but say, yeah, okay, that's fair. Because that's just a matter of like textual criticism. So, another example of where this comes up, if you think of something like Lord of the Rings, okay, J.R.R. Tolkien made this big, amazing world. He wrote languages for the world, So when someone does something in the world or talks about like this historical thing or this language, you can see if it matches the rules that he set up for the world. Now, of course, the world is fake, right? The assumptions are wrong, but the world has internal consistency. Or if you watch a movie and say like, hey, that character did something, said something, that character wouldn't have done that, right? That's broken the internal consistency of the world, right? We know that based on what that character is like, they wouldn't have done that thing. So it sort of breaks the immersion. Okay. So if you ask someone if the Bible is true, they may just balk and say no. If you ask them, is it internally consistent, they may be willing to concede it because it's just a matter of textual scholarship, not of divine truthfulness. Okay. But now, assumptions, you could say, does it seem like, for the first couple classes, that we require some non-contingent, all-powerful, reasoning, willful agent to explain reality and cosmology and consciousness, right? And this is not about the Bible now, but they may also say yes. And I've had some atheists basically saying that, yes, right? But now the thing is, if you put those two together, you've basically got now the Bible's true. Because the assumptions are true, everything it demonstrates within those assumptions is true. Well, that's basically true then. And there's a little bit more nuance to it. That's quite reductive here, but we can maybe see if you break this apart from just is the Bible true into these two parts, you can maybe get people to agree with each part separately. And this is kind of what I was mentioning about, contradictions, or we talked about miracles, right? Within the Bible, miracles are not a problem because the internal consistency of the Bible is such that miracles make a lot of sense because God can interact with the world. So sorry, we're kind of breezing through the last little bit here. That's internal consistency. And the final thing I'll mention is this from C.S. Lewis again, Lewis's trilemma. Okay. So if we're looking at what the Bible says, Jesus made a lot of claims about himself, some bold claims, right? Well, what are the possibilities? Either, he kind of broke it down to sort of like alliterative kind of thing, right? Either Jesus was a liar, because he claims to be God and do all these crazy things, right? So maybe he was lying. Maybe he was a lunatic, because he was just mentally deranged, right? I actually met someone who recently, so he said, escaped from a mental institution in Vancouver and claimed to be Jesus, okay? So maybe Jesus was like that. He was just a lunatic, okay? Number three, maybe he was Lord. And the thing about this is, like, people will sometimes say, well, Jesus had some good messages, but I don't think he was God. Well, people with good messages don't say the kind of things that Jesus said then, right? Because he's a sociopathic liar, right? We typically don't look to sociopathic liars for, fundamental, deep moral truth, right? We dismiss what they say. So what is the other alternative? If Jesus is making all these amazing claims about morality but also divinity and eternity, you can't just say, well, I kind of like some of the stuff he said and the rest I don't really buy. It doesn't really work like that, because he makes some insanely bold claims. So either, yes, he was telling the truth basically about it all, or he was a liar or a lunatic. And so this is what C.S. Lewis said, like, trilemma, tri meaning three. These are the three options. Which one is it then? You cannot split the difference and say, well, Jesus was just a good man. No, a good man wouldn't say the kind of things Jesus said to deceive people. Right. Right, yeah. Well, a couple other things. We're basically out of time here, so I will end it here. So we've kind of run out of time for questions. Of course, if you have any questions, you feel free to save them. We can do it next week, but let me pray and we'll finish up here for today then. Dear Heavenly Father, thank you, Lord, for this class. Thank you, everyone who was able to attend. I just thank you, God, that the word you've given us is so remarkable. Not only, of course, the content, the idea that you love us, you sent your Son to die for us for the salvation of everyone, God, but just the way you put it together across time, across culture, God, with prophecy, with internal consistency, with cohesion, with historical accuracy. It's just a marvel of sort of intellectual analysis, God, that I just thank you that leads us into a marvel of truth and love and salvation, God. So thank you for this class and everyone who's able to attend. I pray that it would be a blessing to their personal faith and for anyone that they may speak to as well, Lord. So thank you, we pray in Jesus' name. Amen. Okay, thank you guys so much. Continuing next week.
Thank you, Ryan.
You're very welcome.